Ready? Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us here in Townsville, but also to all the people online across Australia. My name is Andrew Harford. I'm the team leader of the Sediment and Water Quality team at the Office of the Supervising Scientist, but I'm also the past president of CTAC Australasia. I'd like to begin the day by acknowledging the Woolgaroo Kebab and Bindal people, the traditional owners of the Townsville, as it's on their land that we meet, and we pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and future. We're also meeting across Australia, so I extend that acknowledgement and our respect to all the First Nations people of Australia, and especially any of those people that might be in attendance of this workshop. So CTAC, the Society of Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry, is a global community of professionals with the common goal of improving environmental quality through science. Through our history, including our former selves as the Australasian Society of Ecotoxicology, have really advocated and contributed to the development and improvement of the Australian New Zealand water quality guidelines. The challenges of temporary waters was identified as a priority question during our Global Horizon Scanning project. And we've heard the call from members and our colleagues that they'd like to have a deeper dive into this issue, look at the guidance that exists and the challenges that remain. So thanks to all the contributors. There's a number of you, I won't name you by all, but there's some here in attendance and will be presenting, but there's also contributors that weren't able to make it. But thank you for all the effort that's gone into this workshop. It's going to be a fantastic day. We have a lot of content to get through. And thanks to the territory and state and territory regulators, the PCG, for engaging in this process. It's been good to have those discussions and listen to the challenges, and thank you for the content they've provided and in-kind support for the workshop. Finally, thank you to the Water Division of the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water. They've sponsored this event, and I will hand it over to Marcus Finn, who's the division head of the Water Division, the acting division head, and he will say a few words on behalf of the division and the Q.
Thanks for that, and good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can all hear me. Just if you give me a wave, if you can hear my voice, that'd be good. Yep, excellent. Look, really good to be here today to open this workshop. And it, I guess like a lot of the openings, I'd probably run the risk or absolute certainty that this will be the most or the least important part of the conversation today. But really pleased to not only be able to sponsor this workshop, but also to kick it off. And I will kick off as well by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country that I'm sitting on today. I'm coming to you from Canberra, so actually in the past and present, recognise the deep and enduring relationship that First Nations people had and still have with land, and particularly for us for waters in Australia, and paying respects to First Nations people with us here today. So, and look, I've got to, I guess, kicking this off, I've got to admit I'm a little bit jealous of opening a workshop in Townsville from Canberra. Sort of struck me particularly as I sort of scraped the ice off the window and drove in through the fog this morning. I'm sure where most of you are today, it's a whole lot better. But I do, I guess, just want to, and as we sort of kicked off, talked about the importance of temporary waters, but just how ubiquitous they are around Australia. And I guess sort of driving in this morning and thinking about this, actually thought a bit about the fact that everywhere we look, and pretty much everywhere that I've been and worked, there's temporary waters really close at hand. So, you know, between Sydney and Canberra, you've got the massive Lake George right there. That kind of strikes you each time you drive up and down, and it's either full of water like it is at the moment, or it's a dry grazing paddock. Places like Lake Cow near Forbes, where I grew up. You know, Lake Eyre Kaditunda, which is a massive sort of inland terminal system. And then you think about all of those seasonal systems up in the tropical Northern Territory right down to the Flinders Ranges. And I think if everyone in the room, I'm sure, can think quite easily about places they've worked and been, and temporary waters are right there. And in fact, I think in sort of having looked through some of the materials, I think I saw the statement that you know, temporary waters may well be the majority of Australia's waters. So I think, you know, you'd a really strong argument that they're the main game of what we do today. So I think in terms of having a workshop to think about how to have a better set of and, you know, almost aquatic systems around Australia, I think is really important. So I guess just to sort of kick the workshop off today, just to reflect the same as the opening speaker did about how important this work is. And I think, so the Australian-New Zealand guidelines for fresh and marine water quality, I think, kicked off in 1992. I understand that through a few revisions, that there was one of these workshops in 2015, for example, that set up a set of guidelines for, you know, sort of water quality and toxicology, and they've been used and drawn on. And that this workshop today will not only look at those, but look at the broader guidelines and the broader strategy, and sort of look at the gaps and look at what needs to be done next. I think that's really important for a couple of reasons, not only because it's always good to have a look at our refreshed science and knowledge and then update the information that decision makers draw on to make their decisions and make sure that they're the best informed decisions that we can, but also because we know that the world's sort of changing around us as we go, and getting water management right, water quality right, becomes more and more important. Australia's a place with water is a really scarce resource to start with, so making sure that we manage it well going forward, and guidelines and work like this contributes directly to those sorts of things. So again, maybe just a little bit from me in the opening about how important this work is. I'd probably be a little bit remiss if I didn't give a tiny little plug for the fact that one of the things that we're doing in DECU or in Water Division now is, I guess, kicking off the renewal of the National Water Initiative. So a bit of a plug off to the side, but I think, and there'll be people in the room who've been in some of those discussions for a while now about the fact that the National Water Initiative, like, it forms the framework of good water management in Australia right across all the jurisdictions. Set up agreements to put water plans in place to, you know, make sure water quality is managed, for example, to bring over-extracted systems back to sustainability and keep them that way. Really significant agreement, 2 decades old now, and the Australian guidelines being a fundamental part of the framework in Australia to good water management, solid water management. They stitch into a whole range of other things, either at the national level, things like the National Water Initiative, or at the jurisdictional level, state water management plans, you know, sort of environmental standards through EPAs and other sort of things. So, but I think probably with that, I'd just say again that you know, I did have a bit of a think coming in to open the workshop today about temporary waters. I should, I guess, think a whole lot more about them, given that, again, skimming through some of the background material, one of the first references I came across was Andrew Bolton, who was my supervisor for quite a lot of years. So obviously he had a lot of exposure to temporary waters through Andrew's work, and good company. But again, I'll just sort of reflect on the fact, and I think it's worth reflecting in the room about how widespread, how important and how significant temporary waters are to Australia, how important this sort of work is to make sure that we do have clear guidance and accurate guidance on, you know, how we should manage those things, what water quality standards would be, and what good, bad and ugly looks like in a lot of those systems. And they're widely variable across Australia, which I know is one of the things that you'll talk about today. But again, thanks for everyone's contribution in the past and contribution today. Really important. We're really thankful, which is why we wanted to sponsor this particular workshop. And I guess, you know, most importantly, enjoy the day. I think these days are great opportunities to work together on significant things moving forward. And hopefully everyone has a good day and enjoy it. So thanks very much again for the opportunity, and talk to you all again soon.
Thank you, Marcus, and thanks to Q for sponsoring. It's fantastic to have your support for this discussion. Can you move the slide? Sorry. So let's just talk about the objectives of the workshop. Here we go. So look, we really want to have a look at the existing guidance in this workshop. There's some there, and we're going to go through that in the day. So where we can, we'll provide additional guidance through some case studies and examples for the key issues. But we're really also here to have a look at those gaps, and we're going to be gathering the feedback as we go through the day, and we'll put that back to Q as part of this strategic planning process they're currently going through. So we'll use the water quality management framework as the basis to walk through the guidance. We will hear from the jurisdictions about their key challenges up front, and hopefully some solutions for what they've been dealing with when it comes to temporary waters. We'll focus on the existing guidance that was developed in a 2015 workshop, I believe. So, you know, some time ago. Look, we will acknowledge that the guidelines are just one component of a broader guidelines for overall assessment of ecosystem health and things like that. So we'll bring in some of that other views of the world and how you might look at temporary streams, not just in water quality, but like habitat, those sorts of lenses. We've got a few case studies and examples. We've tried to draw in as much as we can, a practical experience throughout the day. And it's going to be a really big tag team effort. So we want to run a tight ship because we do have a lot of content. So as chair, I'll try and keep that. But at the end of the day, there's a large section for discussion. We don't want to cut into that too much, but if we have to, we might end up doing that. So we're going to seek feedback, identify those goals. If I can ask the people online, use the chat to post questions, and I'll be monitoring that, and I'll ask those questions for you. And for those in the room, we'll have roving mics and things like that so that the people can hear. Please use the mic when you're actually talking, because otherwise online people won't be able to hear. So this is a workshop program for the day. We will need to be perhaps a little bit flexible still. For instance, lunch is actually coming at 12:30, so we'll have to align with that because there are other workshops happening in the building, but we will follow this as closely as we can. And I'll invite Ross up to the stage for the first session on the background on temporary waters.
Thanks, Andrew. And my apologies to everybody that I think many of us have got our voices dropped by an octave over the course of the week. Mine's done slightly worse than most. So I'm just going to give, and this is really from the guidance document. I'm not going in any more detail than is already in there, but just some discussion around how we're going to frame our conversations about temporary waters. So the broader term that we're using is temporary waters, and within that there's a number of different definitions and types of temporary waters. The key type that I'll talk about first are intermittent waters. which are predictably inundated each year. And in Northern Australia, that's quite common. Wet season rainfalls, wet season flows lead to some period of inundation post that rainfall period that's reasonably predictable each year. There's a subset of temporary waters or intermittent waters that are inundated reasonably predictably more than once a year. And examples of that would be the seasonally flowing streams around the Lake Macquarie, Newcastle area, which typically get both spring and autumn rainfall events and tend to be dry in winter and summer. A term that I find is often overused and irks me when it's used in a derogatory sense is ephemeral waters. And in derogatory sense, I mean that some people in some parts, and I won't name names or industries or anything like that, but will say it's only an ephemeral water. We don't need to worry about that. And often they're wrong, because I know that many of those people are referring to intermittent streams that are reliably inundated, reliably part of the ecosystem values of the regions that they're working in. But ephemeral waters are those that are less predictably inundated, really only occurs after unpredictable rainfall or irregular rainfall events. And other examples of that might be at quite some distance. So, for example, a lot of lake air drainage, Georgina, Diamantina, where the rainfall might be from a cyclone event crossing the Great Divide in North Queensland, and eventually the flow will get to Cooper Creek, maybe 6 to 12 months later. More extreme end of ephemeral waters are those episodic systems, rarely inundated, rarely have water present, but do on occasions and have dedicated aquatic organisms that rely on those rare inundations. Temporary waters of all of these different descriptions dominate in Australian ecosystems. 75% of our land mass is semi-arid or arid, but even in the wetter bits, temporary systems can still be quite important, particularly in the upper catchment streams. And I started my research on temporary waters on the Campus Creek at James Cook University, typically regarded as one of the wetter bits of Australia, but that is an intermittent stream inundated reliably in the wet season. Just to go through a little bit more detail of some different types of intermittent streams. This is a picture of a stream in the Settlement Creek Basin, just near the border between Queensland and Northern Territory, predictably inundated during the wet season each year, at least in most years, and obviously with climate variability, even perennial systems can stop flowing in severe El Nino droughts. Most of the seasonal tropics is going to have something like this. They're often the headwaters of larger catchments that may be perennial further downstream. Usually there will be some recessional flow period, often leading to then a period of water retention, and then some or all of those water holes may dry out later in the year. So another system I work on very regularly that falls into this category is the East Branch of the Finnis River, part of a perennial catchment system, but that whole subcatchment is an intermittent stream. Seasonal streams, this is one from the Lake Macquarie district, predictably inundated at least twice in most years, and this one autumn and spring. Rarer in Australia, but common in some areas, as I said. Again, some recessional flow after flow stops. This particular stream, sort of black soil, clayey soil, retains water quite well after the flow, but it will eventually dry out due to evaporation. Ephemeral systems and common ones in the west of the continent will be salt lakes. This is one that my company's worked on in Western Australia. Generally dry, but will fill after rainfall events. If it's a stream, that means typically there'll be little recessional flow period. It'll be flowing immediately after the rainfall, but there'll be little of fluvial aquifer feeding into the system after that rainfall finishes, and unpredictably inundated. The photo here of an episodic system. This is a lignum wetland swamp in the Strzelecki Desert. These systems are formed by clay particles with aeolian deposition between sand dunes in the Strzelecki. They're a clay pan base. The main dominant vegetation in these things is lignum, which is a well-known listed in Queensland wetland plant. This particular one inundated about once a decade, if it's lucky. So a range of different types, a range of different frequency and regularity and predictability of inundation with water. So when we had the workshop in 2015, we really didn't try to make sure that all of the guidance fitted all of the range of water types, but we did try to keep in our minds a reasonable typology of different types of systems so that we could keep cross-checking that the words we were writing would have some relevance to all of them. So we included in that thought process salt lakes, upper catchment desert creeks, the more predictably inundated seasonal wet dry tropics, dryland, floodplain wetlands, and desert swale systems. So that includes the floodplains of inland dryland rivers. So a lot of the Murray-Darling, a lot of the Lake Eyre drainage basin. Temporary waters in internally draining catchments, so that specifically Lake Eyre, and vernal pools. Vernal pools can occur right across Australia. They're isolated, small volume, very transient features, but have been found to be particularly important for a whole range of plants and also amphibian species. So globally, these are regarded as important temporary waters as well. Thank you. He steps back and coughs.
Hello. Ross, we do have one question from online. Where would braid plains or braided rivers fit into these classification systems?
These classification systems are not really about the geomorphology of the system. So a lot of the systems are braided. So Cooper Creek's a highly braided system, and this typically would be classified more in the terms of the inundation frequency as an episodic system. So it's about the water inundation rather than the geomorphology of the waterway itself, if that makes sense. Because what we're talking about is how we're applying water and sediment quality guidelines to these systems, and the presence or absence and the predictability and frequency of the presence or absence of water is really going to be a key characteristic we need to be mindful of.
Thanks. That's great. And keep the questions coming through online through the chat. That's fantastic. Anyone in the room have a question?
I didn't arrange this. This is Nadika.
No worries, Ross. Thank you, Ross. According to climate change, we know rainfall patterns are getting changed, especially in Australia. We can see that. Then according to that, these descriptions are still this rigid, or is there any changes?
It does. What seems to be shifting is that we're shifting the description of streams towards the more ephemeral episodic end of the spectrum. As what we're getting is the climate change seems to be driving more entrenched rain for shorter periods, and particularly in Northern Australia, where that's happening quite noticeably over the last 30 to 50 years, is we're having shorter, more intense wet seasons and longer, more protracted dry seasons, which is shifting things to be from intermittent more towards the episodic end of the spectrum. So it's a good point, Nadika, that we are getting this potentially this shift depending on what climate change is doing in the local area climatically.
I suspect that might come up again during the day. So let's move on to the next section. If you could, we've got next. We've got the jurisdictional presentation. So starting with Queensland, Andrew Moss is here from DES. Thanks for coming, Andrew.
Thanks, Andrew. That's right. Okay, good morning. Just to introduce myself, I'm Andrew Moss. I work in the Science Division in the Department of Environment and Science in Queensland. I don't claim to be an expert on temporary waters. In fact, most of my work is done in estuaries and in coastal areas. But I've also, during my career, had a lot to do with developing water quality guidelines. And that's where my interest comes here in terms of how you set guidelines for temporary waters. Should perhaps just introduce Alicia here. You can put your hand up, who's a bit of an expert on biota in dry stream beds. And we've also got Lee Anderson online, I hope, who has the task of trying to set license conditions for mining areas out west, which is pretty difficult. And we've got Susie over here, Susie Vardy. I should probably just thank Andrew for actually setting up this workshop. I think it's very timely. There's a real need to refocus on temporary streams, which is, we've just heard that they're about 75% of streams in Australia, and there's certainly a big proportion in Queensland. So licensing discharges to these is a very difficult issue for us, and we hope to get some ideas and guidance from the workshop. Press. So documents like the one that Ross was referring to, assessing and managing water in temporary waters, they contain a huge amount of detailed information, and the defining characteristic of these is that temporary waters are incredibly variable. So the issue for us agencies like us is to develop up guidelines or licensing conditions that actually will work in these streams, and it's just, they need to be practical in remote locations. There's often in mining areas there won't be anyone expert on site. They'll rely on consultants coming in once in a blue moon. They need to be cost effective, especially for some of the smaller operations. And obviously they need to provide useful information and an acceptable protection to the environment. So ideally, we would like to condense the massive information that's in that first document into something that's a bit more simplified, that we can provide to a lot of our regional officers so they can go about setting, sensible license conditions. And so we hope this workshop will be part of that process. And we're certainly interested to hear what other jurisdictions are up to. Yeah. So just a very sort of broad overview. Most of our discharges to temporary waters come from coal mines, which mainly on the eastern side of the Great Divide, particularly in the Fitzroy catchment up here. And the other big area of temporary waters discharges is the metalliferous mines, and these quite a big area around here in Mount Isa, but also going up further north and further west. So those are our areas that we have, I guess, most of the issues in setting license conditions. Oh, here we go. So these discharges in the Fitzroy, there's the larger catchments and intermittent flows. The main issue with the coal mines is conductivity or salinity, should I say. The salinity obviously affects downstream biota, but it also has quite significant effects on water use downstream. And it caused quite a lot of issues when one of them, a major pit, overflowed and affected the water quality in Rockhampton. The releases of water can be regulated according to stream flow, and that's because a lot of these streams have good stream flow information and salinity information in those rivers. I'll point it somewhere else. Ah, here it go. Sorry about this. do you know which way I'm supposed to be? Here. Right. So this is a sort of license we can do in those those areas in the Fitzroy, because we know the volumes of water coming down. We know we know, and we know what the base salinity in the water is. We can then calculate what can be released under different flow conditions. So that's not, it's quite a complex way of doing it, but at least it's sort of based on hard information. And obviously the idea is that the resultant salinity from these discharges is below some acceptable limit. Metalliferous mines, obviously, they're quite different. They're discharging to very small, usually dry creeks. They're infrequent discharges. And there's very rarely any local flow data available. So it's very hard for us to set up the sort of system that we see in the Fitzroy. We can't, you know, use the information on flow to set up discharge volumes and things like that. It's difficult for smaller operations to actually set up flow gauging equipment. It's very expensive, and it's a bit hard to justify when these discharges might only happen once a year. So using that sort of system is not possible. So I guess that's one of the areas where we'd certainly like some guidance from this workshop and from as this process goes on, as to how to deal with those discharges to those small dry creeks. Just as a matter of information, that's a stream flow over about 9 years in a small creek in that Flinders catchment, which is up there in the northwest. And you can see it only flows about once every year. And some years it's pretty dry, so they may not, the discharges from mines, they don't only discharge when it's wet because they have to. They don't usually keep the water on site. They mightn't even discharge in these years. So for them, putting a lot of money into setting up infrastructure is pretty big ask. I'll just put in this slide. It was interesting. It's from paper by Mark Kennard, and it sort of classifies streams slightly differently to what Ross used, but it might be of some interest in this process of assessing temporary waters. You can see this triangle here: predictable, summer, highly intermittent. A lot of those are in northwest Queensland, and a lot of those are pretty much what we see here. Predictable in summer, but very intermittent and mostly nil flows. So this is just some suggested discussion points for the workshop. We probably won't cover all of them. So we're interested in what sort of background data needs to be collected, because obviously in a lot of these places, finding reference sites is really difficult. Some discussion maybe on what values small dry creeks really have. Is it useful or practical to monitor biota in these? In some of the larger stream beds, it may be possible to monitor terrestrial fauna. Setting objectives for naturally variable waters, particularly biota. And then an important one here is indicators and guidelines for waterholes. So waterholes are, you know, are usually the refuge for most of the biota during the dry season. So it's really, really important to protect those. This one here, are short-term exceedances of toxicant guidelines acceptable? Well, that's an interesting question. This is about, you know, setting up continuous monitoring in remote areas. If we can't do it, what are the alternatives? This one here, there's a lot of variation. So you can go out and measure a high flow event, but the next high flow event might be quite different. So it's quite difficult to actually characterize them with any precision. And finally, this question about how useful are passive samplers. And so passive samples can potentially quite useful, but they don't work very well in dry conditions. So I don't know if anyone's got any ideas about that. And this, I just sort of threw this in as a conceptual model, I suppose, of what we want. And I apologise to Ross about these definitions. So I guess at the end of the day, we'd like to fill in these boxes. It's perhaps a bit simplistic. This is a typical situation we face as a mine, usually near the headwaters. It discharges into a dry stream that may go into a seasonal stream, and then a temporary waterhole. Well, how important are those? And then permanent waterholes, which are extremely important and need to be protected at all costs. So I just left that there as something that might be of interest in the discussion. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Fantastic, thank you. There's no questions online, any in the room for Andrew? Otherwise, we'll step through to the next jurisdiction, which I believe is South Australia. And we've got Clive Jenkins with us from South Australia EPA. Thanks so much for being here, Clive. No, the slide should be there. Have you made some changes? No, that's good.
How do I drive this? Makes sense? Good. Hi, I'm Clive Jenkins from the South Australian EPA. I'm here really to represent Peter Goonan. He's the principal aquatic biologist in South Australia. I'm a chemist, and this is largely a biology sort of forum, so please excuse my possibly ignorant comments or mispronunciations. So I've only got a couple of slides. In terms of temporary waters, the issue in South Australia is the challenges are twofold. One, this slide is basically presenting the issues around budgetary, institutional and political issues that we've got. So the EPA started monitoring South Australian waters in the mid-90s. In around 2000, so after 15 years or so, we had a massive budget cut. And since then, there's been ongoing queries and criticisms as to why we are monitoring inland surface waters. Realistically, any monitoring that we do has to be very targeted, very purpose-driven. And in this context, monitoring inland waters is SOE driven, state of the environment driven. So as distinct from the previous speaker, it's not targeting particular point sources or assessments. It's just describing the state's waters, their condition. But I use the word political as a challenge a bit cautiously, but in terms of preparing reports, so that the results of the monitoring data that we collect have to be packaged in a way that is informative. But we do package our water quality, macroinvertebrate and vegetation sort of combined assessments in a way that is what we were required in about 2007, 2008 to develop a reporting product that wasn't provocative. It conveyed a message. But the name of the product as it was developed 15, 16 years ago was called Aquatic Ecosystem Condition Reports, which is like a massive mouthful. The reporting framework was bland, and it wasn't supported by very much of a communication strategy. We've got a 6-level rating scheme where the language is sanitised. We were required at the time to not only have a condition rating based on observational data, but also have an expected condition go along with that. So the expected condition is desktop assessment based on land use description and so on. So that, there's that overlay of the realities of what we do in terms of environmental challenges. we've got a statewide stream reach data layer, and we would like to use that we do try to use it in a way that provides for randomised sample site selection, because our remit is to describe the state's waters. Although when we engage with collaborating agencies and stakeholders, they tend to be interested in point locations, and they would like us to go back to specific locations, and we try to randomise our sampling patterns. So each time we revisit a region, we go to new locations. Since about 2007, 2008, our assessment approach when we visit a site has had to be streamlined. So we only do rapid assessments. So that restricts the kind of data that we can collect. It's not feasible for deploying sensor technologies. Prior to 2007, we revisited sites monthly and collected chemistry data. So we can't do that anymore. We only visit a site in spring every 5 years, typically. And any adjustments to the sampling design has to be retrofitted into a very short time frame for sample site work, like about 1.5 hours. So, yeah, that's it in terms of the challenges. The other reality is that South Australia is completely dominated by temporary waters. We've got a few sort of permanent streams in the bottom right-hand corner, the southeast corner of the state. But apart from that, we're about 90% temporary waters. So the rest of I've got other material to explain how we deal with that. But that's it from me in terms of the challenges. I again caveat that by saying this is prepared by Peter Goonan, and if you would like to know more about what we're doing, you should really, I'll give you his contact details and he can explain it in more detail. So if there's any questions, otherwise.
I very much appreciate you stepping in. We don't have anything online. Is there anything in the room? Rick?
Thanks, Clive. Just wondering what you tend to require of operators and proponents in the way of monitoring the systems that they're discharging into or potentially impacting, as opposed to the work that EPA itself does?
Yeah. We don't. So could you give an example of what you would think would be relevant in that context? Because we typically don't. If we've got a wastewater treatment plant that discharges it into an inland waterway, we require them to monitor the discharge itself, but not the receiving environment. And they're required to monitor the discharge with respect to performance measures. So they're obligated to minimise the volume and concentrations of the load of pollutants being discharged, but there are not many surface water discharges in South Australia. Our regulation sort of regime means that wastewaters are very much geared towards reuse. We've got 20-odd wastewater treatment plants in South Australia, and the vast majority of that wastewater is reused to third-party irrigation schemes. So we don't have any structured expectations of point source pollution sites monitoring the receiving environment to describe, for instance, the scale of impact.
Yeah. That answered my question. Thanks.
Thank you, Rick, and you may step up on stage because Rick's kindly stepping in for Western Australia. Tim Storer has been really good at providing us some content and a lot of feedback in the early stages of this planning. but unfortunately couldn't be here, nor could any of the other people in his team. I appreciate that. It's a very long way to come. So Rick's going to do it for them. Thanks, mate.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, everybody. Good morning. Quick disclaimer. I'm not from Western Australia. I don't live in Western Australia. I've never lived in Western Australia. I have done a bit of work in Western Australia. So, but Tim's slides are relatively straightforward. So hopefully I can do an adequate job of representing their views on this matter. And as Andrew said, they're quite engaged and actively interested in assisting and with generating additional guidance, just unable, unfortunately, on this occasion to be able to directly participate. I've got some cheat notes here as well, which might help me. Okay. So challenges and needs for Western Australia. So just as some context, basically the role of the regulator in what is Department of Water and Environmental Regulation over there is for assessing development proposals. So there's a focus there on risks of impacts to environmental values, which of course we now tend to term community values, at least nationally. Licensing operations, so setting operating conditions and also setting relevant limits and water quality objectives. Evaluating monitoring data, and that's for the purpose of assessing compliance, but also assisting with being able to, I suppose, operators and being able to undertake a sort of an adaptive management process. So learn from the results and improve upon them. And also responding to incidents, which will be some sort of spill or fish kills, those sorts of things. That's similar to, I mean, pretty much every regulatory agency through the states and territories, and similar to what Clive was describing in his slides too. So some of the challenges for WA with regards to water quality. So obviously WA, it's a very big area. It's got a lot of different ecosystem types and they're in a range of conditions. So there's a lot to consider when it comes to actually assessing and managing them. Some of the key issues for them, too few guideline values at present. I mean, they're not alone in that regard, and this obviously isn't just a temporary waters issue, but it's a general water quality, aquatic ecosystem issue. And they've also got a focus at the moment on what we might call technology critical elements. Obviously, there's a lot of activity nationally, but particularly in Western Australia around some of these metals and metalloids. Where guideline values do exist, there are few or no WA species represented in the underlying data sets. And also currently there are few commercial ecotoxicity tests for WA species, and we'll get to this a little bit when it comes to the needs for WA. Continuing with challenges, so WA, as was kind of alluded to, they've got a lot of unique and or isolated systems, and these systems contain many specialist species, and it's unclear whether the tolerances of these species are different to the standard ecotox testing species. So really just that greater uncertainty around potential sensitivity of these ecosystems, these unique and very isolated systems. Also the fact that they might be unique, there's not many of them, they might be isolated. It's very hard to find reference sites for such systems. And also, as is often the case elsewhere, there's often no pre-impact baseline. And this is, I think, will be a recurring theme across today, and Andrew's already mentioned it, difficult to assess impacts when contaminant exposures are very short and localised. So it can be hard to actually detect the contaminant because it comes and goes rather quickly. And also this was an interesting point, that it's important to understand sort of what they term critical exposure points. So it's effectively where a species sort of critical development window or period aligns with the contaminant pulse. And where this occurs, effectively, it means that dilution alone may not be sufficient to minimise the risk of impacts, because you're aligning the discharge with points in time when critters might actually be particularly more sensitive. So continuing on with the challenges, and some of those include dealing with downstream effects. So, for example, where contaminants accumulate in depositional zones, a particular distance downstream from the discharge, the ability to identify those and understand where they are and what the impacts might be. And also spatial and temporal changes in water quality that can influence contaminant bioavailability and toxicity. And these things can change quite rapidly, and I'll touch on that later too. And how does one take that into account? They've provided an example of issues for salt lakes, but a lot of these issues will also be relevant to other temporary waters as well. So these salt lakes, they've got high development pressure, but at the same time, they're viewed or portrayed as having little environmental value, or because they're already salty, then they'll be tolerant to additional salt inputs. They tend to have low species richness. That means it can be difficult to find good indicator species, and their short wetting periods make them difficult to monitor and to establish baselines. And that last point there, basically the short development windows and life cycles of species makes it difficult to establish thresholds for those species and communities and to determine impacts. And there's also the issue of delayed impacts, where effectively you might not see the impact straight away, but it comes in the next wetting cycle. And that's an interesting one with regards to challenges to actually regulate. So that challenge gets even bigger when you have the overlay of changing climate, which again has already been mentioned this morning, something that Nadika flagged. When basically you end up with the problem of apportioning the relative contribution of changing climate and land use activities on ecosystem changes. So you've got ordered flow regimes and related water quality changes. What's the relative contribution of the changing climate and that other anthropogenic land use activity? Dealing with discharges in a drier climate with less dilution. So if dilution is being a primary mechanism by which impacts are being, or risks are being minimised, when you've got dry climate, less water, how's that going to be dealt with? There's a whole issue of long-term dewatering. So obviously with a lot of these operations, they move systems from an ephemeral system to a perennial system, but then down the track when those dewatering activities, obviously that has its own issues. And then when those dewatering activities finish, then they're going back to ephemeral systems. And the point that's being made there is that going back from perennial to ephemeral, while that's sending it back to a more natural state, again, if dilution is being used, then you've got issues because you may not have that dilution anymore with regards to discharges and minimising risks. So what was once acceptable for discharge regulation may no longer be acceptable in the case of changing climate. And also as systems are changing, for example, from perennial back to ephemeral, etc., then you will need to update your baselines based on the change in state of those systems. Okay, so final slide for WA in terms of their key needs. The first one is something that's not been raised yet, but again, that's regards to what they were saying earlier, but around test development for WA species. So talking ecotox test development for WA species. Now, I know that that's already underway in WA to quite a significant degree through both government and industry funded projects. And again, as I flagged, there's an initial focus on the technology critical elements there. So they're proactively working to address that gap from their perspective. And the second main one, which aligns with Queensland and the sort of simplified procedure that Andrew talked about, is some sort of temporary waters decision tool for regulators that includes more specific guidance and also case studies for common temporary water scenarios. And they've got a bunch listed below there. So yeah, that aligns with what Andrew was getting at, with some sort of simplified procedure. And it's probably something that we may want to pick up and discuss later this afternoon. For people aware of the ANZG guidelines website, it provides case studies for particular uses of the guidelines. And one could possibly see that case studies and examples relating to specific temporary water scenarios could be developed and assist when it comes to regulators trying to work out what to do. Okay, I will leave it there. Can't say I can actually answer any questions, but they could certainly be sent on notice to WA.
Again, no questions online. So is there any in the room?
Questions or comments, of course.
Yeah,
comments are good.
That's the end of the jurisdictional feedback. That's what we got from the people that we reached out to. So, of course, there are others that have concerns, but that's what we have. Yes, bro. Sorry, Barry.
So, what's the connection between heavy metals and nitrate?
I mean to ask that myself, Barry. I was unclear about whether that was an error in the slide or there's an issue of effectively there being so much nitrate in the system that that's the primary stressor and other contaminants are really not going to be that significant. Sure. That's the only thing I could think of. I don't know whether anyone else has any idea about that.
Well, that would make sense.
Yeah. That's definitely one we can ask what that is. Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else? Well, if there's nothing else, we're actually running ahead of time. We've got 15 minutes and your next section is 15 minutes. So let's push on
in theory
and get it done before morning tea.
Okay, that's all good. Okay, so that moves us into, I suppose, the nuts and bolts of the workshop, which